I know this might sound strange, maybe even absurd, but something happened to Pooh. Something I still can't explain, even after all these years. I haven't been back to the 100-acre woods since it all happened, and honestly, I'm not sure I ever want to. Back then, we were all so close. Pooh, Piglet, Tigger, Eeyore, all of us. Those summers were magical, simple, filled with the kind of warmth you think can never fade. But one summer it all changed. It started the day Pooh found that damn pot of honey. He said he discovered it in a clearing on the far side of the woods, a part none of us really ventured into. Pooh always loved honey, but this pot, it was different, bigger than any I'd seen. Its surface was a dull, tarnished gold with strange symbols carved into it. Symbols that didn't look like anything I'd seen in any of my books. Pooh was so excited when he brought it back. He kept saying the honey inside smelled incredible, better than anything he'd ever tasted. But when he pried the lid open, I swear the air around us shifted. The smell was sweet, yes, but there was something else, something bitter and sharp like metal or decay. It made my stomach twist. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Pooh did what he always did. He grabbed a spoon and dug right in. He ate and ate, humming to himself like he always did. But the next day, things were off. Pooh wasn't at his usual spot by the tree where he liked to nap. Piglet found him wandering near the edge of the forest, mumbling to himself. He said Pooh didn't recognize him at first, even though they'd been friends for years. When I found him later, he looked tired, like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes seemed darker somehow, sunken and distant, but he smiled and said he was fine. I wanted to believe him, but something felt wrong. I just couldn't figure out what. Over the next few days, things got worse. Pooh started acting strangely, even for him. He'd always been a little forgetful, but now it was like he didn't even know where he was half the time. He kept wandering off on his own, muttering about, finding more. Well, what? I didn't know. When we asked him, he'd laugh it off and change the subject, but there was this edge to his voice that wasn't like him. Even Tigger noticed, and he usually ignored anything that wasn't fun. He told me, something ain't right with Pooh Bear. That was the first time I felt real fear about what was happening. The others tried to help. Piglet, bless him, was the first to reach out. He went to Pooh's house with some fresh flowers, hoping to cheer him up. But when Piglet came back, he looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost. He wouldn't tell us what happened, just kept shaking his head and whispering, "He's not Pooh anymore. I want to check on him myself the next day." Pooh wasn't in his usual chair or by the fireplace. I found him in the back, sitting cross-legged on the floor with that pot of honey. He didn't look up when I came in. His paw was sticky, trembling as he scooped out another bite. And his eyes, those bright, friendly eyes, were blank, almost hollow. I asked him if he was okay, but he didn't answer at first. When he finally did, his voice sounded distant, like he was talking to someone far away. "It's not enough," he said. "I need more." I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it sent chills through me. The pot of honey, it should have been empty by then, but somehow it wasn't. It looked just as full as when he'd found it. That's when I noticed the symbols on the pot weren't the same as before. They'd changed, grown more elaborate, like they were spreading. I tried to take the pot away, but Pooh grabbed my wrist harder than I thought he could. "Don't," he said, his voice low and cold. "You wouldn't understand." After that, none of us could ignore it anymore. Even Eeyore, who rarely got involved, said he felt something was wrong in the woods. The air felt heavier, and the trees seemed taller, darker. It was subtle at first, but soon we all started hearing things. Whispers carried on the wind, too faint to make out but impossible to ignore. Tigger stopped bouncing as much, saying he felt like something was watching him. Rabbit claimed his garden wasn't growing right, even though it had always thrived. It was as if the 100-acre wood itself was changing, twisting into something we didn't recognize. And at the center of it all was Pooh and that cursed pot of honey. One evening, Piglet came running to me, his little legs trembling so much he could barely stand. He was crying, saying he heard Pooh talking to someone in the woods. Not another animal. There was no one else around. But someone. I tried to calm him down, but deep down, I felt the same unease he did. So, I decided to go see for myself. I grabbed a lantern and headed toward Pooh's house. The path there felt longer than usual, the trees closing in on me like a tunnel. By the time I reached his door, the sun was gone, and the woods were eerily silent. No crickets, no breeze, just the sound of my footsteps and my breathing. Pooh wasn't inside. The pot of honey was gone too, and the air smelled thick, like that strange metallic sweetness I'd noticed before. I called out for him, but no one answered. That's when I saw the footprints leading into the forest, deeper into the part we'd always avoided. They were sticky, leaving dark marks on the ground, almost like tar. Against my better judgment, I followed them. With each step, the forest seemed darker, the trees more twisted. The lantern's light barely reached beyond a few feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, Pooh's voice, but it didn't sound like him. It was deeper, almost guttural, and he was laughing. Not his usual soft chuckle, but something cold and sharp, like broken glass. I finally saw him in a clearing, sitting cross-legged with a pot of honey in front of him. The symbols on it were glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Pooh's fur looked matted and darker than usual, as if it had been stained. He didn't look up when I approached. Instead, he dipped his paw into the pot and raised it to his mouth, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was in a trance. "Pooh," I said, my voice shaking. He stopped mid-motion, his paw hovering near his face. Then he turned to look at me, and I'll never forget his eyes. They weren't Pooh's eyes anymore. They were black, glossy, and empty, like looking into a void. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice echoing in a way that didn't make sense. Before I could respond, the wind picked up, swirling around the clearing. The trees seemed to groan, their branches reaching down like claws. The whispers I'd been hearing grew louder, almost deafening, but I still couldn't understand them. Pooh stood up, clutching the pot to his chest. "It's too late now," he said almost sadly. "I can't stop it." Then he turned and walked deeper into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I wanted to follow him, but something held me back, an overwhelming sense of dread, like if I took one more step, I'd never find my way out. So I ran. I don't even remember how I made it back to the others, but when I did, I couldn't stop shaking. When I got back to the others, I could barely get the words out. Piglet was already trembling, his tiny hands clutching his ears like he was trying to block out the whispers we all seemed to hear now. Tigger, usually so full of energy, just sat there staring at the ground. "What did you see?" Rabbit asked, his voice sharp but laced with fear. I tried to explain. The pot, the symbols, the way Pooh's eyes had looked, but the words felt hollow, like they couldn't capture the wrongness of it all. None of us could sleep that night. The forest didn't feel like home anymore. The wind seemed to carry voices, and the shadows stretched too far, like they were alive. The next morning, Christopher Robin showed up. He hadn't been around much that summer, and I could see the worry on his face the moment he arrived. "What's going on?" he asked, looking at all of us huddled together like frightened children. I told him everything, trying to keep my voice steady, but when I got to the part about Pooh, Christopher's face changed. He didn't look surprised. He looked scared. "I need to see him," he said, grabbing his bag and heading toward the woods before we could stop him. None of us wanted to go back there, but we couldn't let him go alone. So we followed, even though every instinct screamed at us to turn back. We found Pooh near the same clearing I'd seen him in the night before. But now the place looked wrong. The trees surrounding it were dead, their bark blackened and twisted. The ground was soft and wet, like it had been soaked in something thick and sticky. And there was Pooh, sitting in the center with a pot of honey, his back to us. Christopher called out to him, but Pooh didn't move. When we got closer, the smell hit us, sweet and rotten, like fruit left to decay in the sun. Christopher stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Pooh, it's me, Christopher Robin. What's going on?" Pooh turned slowly, and for a moment, I thought he recognized him. But then he smiled, and it wasn't the warm, friendly smile we all knew. It was stretched too wide, his teeth bared in a way that made my stomach churn. "Christopher," he said, his voice low and mocking. "You came back." His paw dipped into the honey, and as he lifted it, I saw something moving in it, tiny black shapes writhing like insects. He licked it clean, his eyes never leaving Christopher. "You should try some," he said, holding the pot out. "It's divine." Christopher froze, staring at Pooh as if he were seeing a stranger. None of us moved. The pot of honey glistened in the dim light, and I swear the symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift, crawling like living things. Pooh held it out farther, his paw trembling slightly. "Don't be rude, Christopher," he said, his voice lilting unnaturally, like he was mocking the way he used the sound. "It's what you always wanted, isn't it? To see what's out there beyond the trees. To taste something more." His eyes, black and endless, locked onto Christopher's, and for a moment, I thought Christopher might take it. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out, but then he stopped, shaking his head. "No," Christopher said firmly, his voice breaking the eerie silence. "This isn't you, Pooh. Whatever that is, it's not for us." Pooh's smile faltered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression. Pain, maybe a regret. But then his face hardened, and he pulled the pot back to his chest, clutching it like a lifeline. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have to. It's too late." He turned away from us, his shoulders slumping. "You should leave. All of you." But we didn't. We couldn't. Christopher stepped closer, reaching out a hand. "We're not leaving you, Pooh," he said softly. "We can fix this. We just need to get rid of." Before he could finish, Pooh spun around with a speed that made my heart stop. His paw lashed out, knocking Christopher back into the dirt. "No!" Pooh roared, his voice echoing unnaturally, like it came from the woods themselves. The ground beneath us seemed to tremble, and the whispers we'd been hearing grew louder, more insistent. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches twisting toward us like skeletal fingers. Tigger grabbed my arm. "We gotta go," he said, his voice trembling, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. But Christopher wouldn't move. He stood up, brushing the dirt off his knees, and looked at Pooh with a mix of sadness and determination. "We're not leaving," he said again, his voice steady. "We're your friends, Pooh. We'll fight this together." Pooh's body shook, his fur bristling, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out again. But then he let out a low, broken laugh. "You can't fight it," he said, turning his gaze back to the pot. "It's already here." Pooh's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "It's already here." The forest seemed to react, the ground beneath us feeling softer, almost like it was alive. Christopher didn't back down. "Then we'll stop it," he said, his voice firm, though I could hear the tremor in it. Pooh looked at him, and for the briefest moment, his expression softened. But then his eyes darkened again, and he clutched the pot tighter, as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "It's not just the honey. It's everything. The woods they've always been watching." Those words sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around at the trees towering over us, their branches swaying even though there was no wind. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, moving independently of the light. "Pooh," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What did you bring here?" He didn't answer, but the way he glanced at the pot told me everything. Whatever that honey was, it wasn't just food, it was something ancient, something that had been waiting to be found. And Pooh had been the one to open the door. Tigger tugged on Christopher's sleeve. "We need to go, buddy," he said, his usual balance completely gone. "This place ain't safe anymore." Christopher hesitated, torn between leaving and trying to help Pooh. But before he could make a decision, the clearing changed. The ground beneath us cracked, and a deep, low sound filled the air, like a groan from something massive and alive. The pot in Pooh's hands began to glow, the symbols pulsing faster and faster. Pooh staggered, dropping to his knees, and for the first time, He looked scared. "I told you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's too late." The whispers that had haunted us for days grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. I couldn't understand the words, but they were filled with malice, crawling into my ears and burrowing into my mind. Piglet screamed, clutching his head, and even Tigger dropped to the ground, covering his ears. Christopher, however, stood his ground. "Pooh," he shouted over the noise. "You have to let it go. Destroy the pot." Pooh looked at him, his paws shaking, and for a moment I thought he might do it. But then he shook his head. "I can't," he said, tears streaming down his face. "It's not mine to destroy." The ground beneath us began to shift, rising and falling in waves like it was breathing. The clearing felt alive, a pulsing, writhing thing that seemed to react to every movement we made. The glow from the pot intensified, and the symbols carved into its surface now radiated with a sickly, golden light that painted everything around us in an unnatural hue. Pooh, still clutching the pot, looked more fragile than ever, his fur damp with sweat, his body trembling like a puppet on fraying strings. "It's not just the honey," he muttered, almost to himself. "It's the forest. It always was." Christopher stepped forward again, ignoring the trembling earth and the deafening whispers around us. "Then we'll destroy the forest if we have to," he said, his voice filled with a desperation I'd never heard before. Pooh let out a bitter laugh, one that sounded wrong coming from him. "You can't destroy it," he said. "It's part of us now. Part of me?" His voice cracked on that last word, and for a moment, I saw the old Pooh, the friend we all loved, flicker across his face. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by something darker, something I didn't recognize. The clearing began to close in on us. The trees bent inward, their branches curling like claws. Shadows stretched toward us, moving faster now, like they had a purpose. Piglet whimpered, clinging to Tigger, who for once had no jokes to offer. Rabbit was frozen in place, his wide eyes darting between the pot and the encroaching darkness. "We have to do something," I shouted, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the cacophony around us. Christopher's gaze locked onto the pot. "That's it," he said, his voice low but steady. "The pot is the key. If we destroy it, maybe this will stop." But Pooh heard him. His head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "No," he roared, clutching the pot tighter. "You don't understand. Without it, I'm nothing." He staggered to his feet, swaying like he was fighting something inside himself. The ground buckled, and we all stumbled, struggling to stay upright. "Pooh, please," Christopher pleaded. "This isn't you. You're more than this. You're our friend." For a moment, I thought Christopher's words might reach him. Pooh's grip on the pot loosened, and his shoulders slumped. But then the glow from the symbols flared, brighter than ever, and his face twisted in pain. "I can't stop it," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's too strong." The ground cracked open beneath us, splitting into jagged crevices that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. From the depths came a sound, a deep, resonating hum, like the growl of something ancient and angry. Christopher didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing for the pot. Pooh tried to pull back, his paws gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white, but Christopher wasn't letting go. "Let it go, Pooh," he shouted, his voice filled with raw emotion. "This isn't you. It's never been you." Pooh growled, a low, guttural sound I didn't think he was capable of, and for a moment, it looked like he might strike Christopher. But instead, his legs buckled, and he dropped to his knees. "I don't want to lose myself," Pooh whispered, his voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the chaos around us. His eyes, now flickering between black voids and the warm, familiar brown we knew, met Christopher's. "But I can't stop it." "You have to," he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the pot. The glow was blinding now, the symbols writhing like living things. Christopher gritted his teeth and pulled with all his strength, tearing the pot from Pooh's grasp. The moment it left his paws, the entire forest screamed. Or at least it felt like it did. The sound wasn't just in my ears. It was in my head, vibrating through my bones. Christopher didn't waste a second. He hurled the pot to the ground with all his might, and it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The glow vanished instantly, plunging the clearing into near-total darkness. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. For a moment, none of us moved. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the ground began to stabilize, the cracks sealing themselves as if they'd never been there. The trees straightened, their branches no longer reaching for us. But Pooh collapsed. We rushed to him, but he looked so small, so fragile. His fur was dull, his eyes half closed. "Is it over?" Piglet asked, his voice trembling. Christopher knelt beside Pooh, cradling him like a child. "I don't know," he said, his voice heavy with grief. Pooh blinked slowly, looking up at Christopher. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then his eyes closed, and for a moment, I thought he was gone. But his chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. Whatever had taken hold of him seemed to be gone, but so was a part of him, something we'd never get back. We stayed there in the clearing for what felt like hours, none of us knowing what to do next. Pooh's breathing was faint but steady, and Christopher wouldn't let go of him. The forest around us seemed still, almost eerily so, as if it were holding back its true nature. None of us spoke, afraid that even a whisper might stir something back to life. Finally, Christopher broke the silence. "We need to get him home," he said, his voice firm but strained. Tigger nodded and helped Christopher lift Pooh. He was surprisingly light, like all the strength had been drained from his body. The walk back to Pooh's house was agonizing. Every step felt like it took hours, the forest still heavy with that strange energy. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting them to move again, but they stood still, their branches lifeless. When we reached Pooh's house, Christopher laid him gently on his bed. Piglet brought a blanket and tucked it around him, his tiny hands shaking the whole time. "Is he going to be okay?" Piglet asked, his voice breaking. Christopher didn't answer right away. He just sat by the bed, staring at Pooh's motionless form. "I think he will," he finally said, though he didn't sound convinced. Over the next few days, things in the 100-acre would seem to return to normal, at least on the surface. The forest was quiet again, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. But none of us could shake the feeling that something had changed. Pooh stayed in his house, too weak to leave his bed. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was in a soft, distant voice, like he was speaking from a dream. The honey pot was gone, but its memory lingered. Every time I passed that part of the forest, I felt a chill, like something was still watching. Christopher visited Pooh every day, sitting by his side and talking to him, even if Pooh didn't respond. One afternoon, as I stood outside the house, I heard Christopher ask, "Do you remember what it felt like?" There was a long pause, and then Pooh whispered, "It felt like hunger." But not mine. That was the last time Pooh spoke about the pot or what happened in the clearing. Slowly, he began to recover, but he was never the same. His laugh didn't have the same warmth, and his eyes carried a weight I couldn't understand.